In a sea cave off the Scottish coast, lit only by torches and the glint of hanging human limbs, a family fed on the flesh of over 1,000 people. For 25 years no one knew they were there. No one survived long enough to tell. This isn't a legend. It's not a ghost story. This is real history. The story of the Bean clan. A bloodline so monstrous Scotland erased them from memory. In a sea cave off the Scottish coast, lit only by torches and the glint of hanging human limbs, a family fed on the flesh of over 1,000 people. For 25 years no one knew they were there. No one survived long enough to tell. This isn't a legend. It's not a ghost story. This is real history. The story of the Bean clan. A bloodline so monstrous Scotland erased them from memory. The year was 1400 and Scotland was a land caught in transition. A brutal hybrid of medieval superstition and early Renaissance thinking. Civil wars and fractured loyalties left the countryside lawless, especially in the rocky wilderness of Galloway, where cliffs dropped into black tides and justice was just a rumor. It was in this liminal landscape, between civilization and savagery, that a man named Alexander Sawney Bean was born. Raised in poverty in East Lothian, Bean wasn't merely a product of his environment. He was something darker. Historical fragments describe a violent boy who rejected every constraint society tried to place on him. He didn't want to bend the law. He wanted to live outside it entirely. His fate changed the moment he met Agnes Douglas, a woman whose name was whispered alongside words like witchcraft, murder, and unnatural lust. Together they didn't fall in love. They made a pact, not to build a life, but to destroy others. They vanished into the wilderness, not for peace or solitude but to hunt. They sought a place where no morality could reach them, where hunger could evolve into ritual, where evil could root and grow undisturbed. They found it. Near Ballantrae, along the Ayrshire coast, the tide concealed the entrance to a cave that stretched nearly a mile into the earth. It was dark, was hidden, and twice a day the sea itself would rise and wipe away any trace of who entered or left. To the Beans it was perfect. Inside they lit fires, carved living quarters, and began raising a family, in total darkness. But what made this family different wasn't just where they lived. It was what they ate. At first the victims were few, a merchant here, a pilgrim there. Travel in medieval Scotland was dangerous enough that a few missing souls raised no alarms. But the Beans didn't just kill. They consumed. Flesh, muscle, organs, nothing went to waste. What began as survival slowly twisted into sacred ritual. And by the time their children were born in that cave, cannibalism wasn't horrifying. It was normal. Their sons and daughters never saw sunlight. They never heard a voice not shaped by the cave's echoes. They never tasted food that hadn't once spoken. Their education was pure horror. How to track a man by footfall. How to bleed him without waste. How to preserve his body like salted pork. How to obey the clan, or die. And as their numbers grew, so did their efficiency. What started as desperation became a system. And soon, a civilization of flesh. Deep inside their hidden fortress of stone, something unnatural was taking root. Agnes Bean gave birth again and again. In darkness, in silence, surrounded by the bones of the devoured. Each child was born into a world where human flesh was food. Murder was family tradition. And the light of morality never touched the walls. The outside world knew nothing of these children. And the children knew nothing of the outside world. They walked barefoot on cold rock. Learned to move by scent and sound alone. Their lullabies were screams. Their lessons were slaughter. There was no schooling. No kindness. Only survival and obedience. As the clan grew, so did their need to stay pure. Sawney understood that even a single outsider could corrupt his family's twisted equilibrium. So he enforced a rule more horrific than any law. No one mates beyond the bloodline. Mothers bred with sons. Sisters with brothers. The family tree twisted into a circle of madness. And the children that came from these unions? Inhuman. They didn't walk like normal people. They crept, crawled, watched with wide, lightless eyes that reflected torchlight like animal pupils. They could mimic natural sounds in the cave. Whispers carried through tunnels like breath on the wind. A snap of bone. A sniff of blood. A signal to strike. They didn't just hunt. They hunted together, with the coordination of a wolf pack and the cunning of humans. Their ambushes became legendary in their silence. A merchant wagon would vanish without a trace. A group of pilgrims never seen again, save for a few dropped shoes or a blood-stained ribbon. They didn't take valuables. They took bodies. Dragged them back, still breathing, into the cave. The feasting was the centerpiece of clan life. The fresher, the better. Those captured alive were stripped, restrained, and processed like livestock. The family had rituals. Smoked meat for winter. Salted limbs for lean months. Fresh hearts for strength. Body parts hung from rusted hooks hammered into the stone. Walls were lined with arms, torsos, scalps, preserved by time and tide. It wasn't savagery. It was craftsmanship. The clan had designated chambers. Butchering alcoves. Smoking pits. Storage crevices carved into rock. Nothing was wasted. Not even the bones. Some became furniture. Others tools. And many were simply left scattered as if forgotten or worshipped. The children of Sonny and Agnes didn't know what they were doing was wrong. To them, human flesh was no more taboo than salted fish or mutton. Their language, if you could call it that, was a dialect corrupted by generations of isolation. They didn't understand fear or pity or shame. They understood only hunger and loyalty. To betray the clan was to become the meat. By now, the family had grown to over 40 members. A self-sustaining, multi-generational civilization of cannibals. And they were no longer content with picking off the weak. They began hunting entire caravans. And that was their first mistake. By the time the Bean clan reached its third generation, their cave was no longer just a hideout. It was an ecosystem of evil. A butcher's palace carved in stone. A kingdom built not on crops or coin, but on flesh. And now it hungered for more. No longer satisfied with lone travelers and unlucky wanderers, the clan began attacking entire groups. Merchant caravans. Pilgrim convoys. Even whole families moving between villages. And they didn't just kill. They wiped them away as if they had never existed. In the beginning, the disappearances were dismissed. The medieval Scottish Highlands were no stranger to danger. Bandits, wolves, rockslides, and war. Death came easy. But soon a pattern emerged. Trade routes that had been safe for generations suddenly became death traps. Caravans vanished. Bones surfaced in tidal pools. Tales began to circulate. A creature that struck silently. A cursed family born of the devil. A hunger in the hills that no prayer could satisfy. The whisper of something out there became impossible to ignore. Then came the turning point. A wedding party was traveling back from May festivities. Nearly 30 people. Laughter echoing, children playing, newlyweds wrapped in joy. They never reached home. The Bean clan descended from the cliffs like shadows with teeth. What followed was not a robbery, but a slaughter. Men were hacked down. Women were dragged away. Children were stuffed into sacks, alive and screaming. A few survived by sheer luck. And for the first time, Scotland heard from those who had seen the Beans with their own eyes. The survivors' testimony shook the region. Attackers who moved like soldiers but looked inhuman. Eyes that reflected fire. Voices that didn't sound right, warped dialects, animal-like clicks. No interest in coin or gold, only in flesh. Victims dragged away alive, not slain on the spot. This wasn't banditry. It was harvesting. And it had gone on for decades. When the stories reached King James I, he was skeptical at first. The throne had its own problems. Uprisings, border wars, famine. But when the missing started to include nobles, priests, and key merchants, the king had no choice but to act. What began as a royal audit turned into something far more terrifying. Court scribes began compiling a ledger of the missing. And what emerged was not a few isolated cases, but a list of over 1,000 names. Disappeared. Gone without a trace. Whole family lines extinguished. And as maps were drawn, a pattern took shape. A circle of terror with one focal point. The Galloway coast. Search parties were formed. Elite trackers, many of them veterans of England's brutal border wars, were deployed. They fanned out across forests, valleys, and most importantly, the caves. And then, one royal hunting party chasing deer made a chilling discovery. A strange tidal pattern. A draft of air where there should be solid rock. A hidden seam in the cliffside. They lit torches, drew swords, and stepped inside. What they found defied human comprehension. When the royal hunting party forced their way past the narrow, sea-slicked stone, they expected to find a bandit's den. Instead, they entered hell. The cave opened into a massive subterranean chamber. The air was thick, not with smoke but with the stench of rot and iron. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a slaughterhouse. Bones littered the ground like fallen branches. Human skulls arranged on rock ledges like trophies. Hooks driven into stone held torsos, arms, and limbs, preserved like meat at a butcher's stall. Some were freshly carved. Others long since yellowed with time. There were smoking pits where flesh had been dried and preserved. There were salt chambers, crude but effective, used to cure meat for long storage. There were even gutting tables, carved from stone, stained dark from years of use. It was an efficient system. A civilization built around processing human beings like livestock. The deeper they went, the worse it became. The soldiers passed chambers used for sleeping, beds fashioned from human skin, pillows stuffed with hair, chairs crafted from femurs and ribs. There was no attempt to hide any of it. The beings had no shame. No sense that what they had built was anything but natural. And then, they found them. 48 members of the Bean clan, huddled in the farthest chamber, crouched in silence as the torchlight hit their pale skin. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They watched. Skin bleached white from a lifetime without sunlight. Eyes glowing eerily in the firelight, wide, black, unblinking. Movements slow, coordinated, almost animal. The youngest children, born in complete darkness, didn't speak. They hissed. They clicked. They moved like predators, their heads twitching at sounds, their hands twitching with instinct. Then, from the back of the group, an ancient woman emerged. Agnes Bean. Old now. Wrinkled, toothless, but unafraid. She spoke in a dialect so broken it was barely human. Yet what she said was unmistakable. They didn't regret anything. They didn't understand the horror. They didn't believe they had done wrong. She explained their way of life, with total calm. As if it were farming. As if the soldiers had just walked in during dinner. One captain vomited. Another wept. Even the war-hardened veterans of Scotland's border conflicts had never seen anything like this. Because this wasn't just evil. It was generational. The Beans weren't hiding. They weren't surviving. They were thriving. They had created an entire culture around cannibalism. Rituals. Rules. Roles. They raised children to kill. And those children raised more. They had forgotten what human society even looked like. And worse, they didn't care. The soldiers had seen enough. They chained every member of the clan, old and young, and dragged them out, blinking into the sunlight for the first time. The sea behind them washed blood from the cave floor. But the memory would never be clean. The horror had been unearthed. And Scotland now faced an even darker question. What do you do with people who are no longer human? The Bean clan was led from the cave in chains, blinking into the sun, silent, pale as ghosts, soulless as beasts. And when the royal guards looked into their eyes, they didn't see people. They saw predators. The law had no protocol for this. How do you try someone who doesn't know what justice is? Who has never seen a courtroom, heard a priest, or read a single word of scripture? They couldn't understand the charges. They didn't fear the sentence. They didn't even seem to grasp why they were being taken. To the Beans, eating humans wasn't murder. It was life. So King James I made a decision that would echo across legal history. No trial. No appeal. No defense. The Bean clan would be exterminated, not as criminals, but as a pestilence. A disease to be burned out. The execution was ordered to take place in Edinburgh. Thousands gathered, not in celebration but in grim curiosity. What they saw would stay with them for life. The men were executed first. Each had their hands and feet hacked off in the public square. No sedative. No mercy. They bled out slowly, writhing, still staring with blank, uncomprehending eyes. Their bodies didn't scream defiance. They simply collapsed like sacks of meat drained of blood. The crowd, used to hangings and beheadings, was silent. Because this wasn't justice. It was an extermination. Then came the women and children. They were forced to watch the men die. Their fathers, their sons, their mates. And when the last man fell, the pyres were lit. Agnes Bean stood at the edge of the flames. Not crying, not begging. Just watching as her family was consumed one last time. The flames didn't seem to frighten the children. Some reached toward them, fascinated. Some stared into the crowd with pity, as if confused why everyone was so upset. They were burned alive. All of them. And by sunset the Bean clan was gone. But something strange happened. The crowds didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They walked home in silence. As if something had been cleansed. But also broken. Chronicles from the times speak of hardened executioners who couldn't sleep afterward. Priests who refused to perform blessings. Children who wept not for the Beans, but for what they had witnessed in the faces of the crowd. Because somewhere in the horror was a glimpse of ourselves. The Bean clan had lived outside the bounds of humanity. But what did it say about us? That we met their evil with equal savagery? Was it justice? Or was it vengeance with better clothes? The question would linger in Scottish memory and grow darker with time. The flames that consumed the Bean clan died out that day. But the echo of their horror never truly faded. Not in the Highlands. Not in the courts. And not in the collective conscience of a nation. Because what Scotland burned in Edinburgh wasn't just a family, was a question. 4 years after the execution, the coastal cave near Ballantrae was declared cursed. Locals avoided it. Clergy attempted to collapse it with stone and prayer. But visitors still came, drawn by a force they couldn't name. Not curiosity. Not fear. But something darker. Recognition. Merchants returned to their routes. Villages rebuilt. But scars remained, not on the roads but in memory. Entire communities that had lost generations remained depopulated for decades. Families who had vanished left only names and ledgers. Children who saw the executions never forgot the eyes of the Bean clan, or the silence of the crowd. And from this silence, a legend was born. Sawney Bean became a ghost story. A tale told to frighten children and warn travelers. But the story changed. Over time the details were twisted. The numbers exaggerated. The cave turned mythical. The horror softened with fiction. What began as fact slowly morphed into folklore. Because sometimes, it's easier to believe in monsters than to accept what humans become when no one's watching. Modern psychologists studying the clan's behavior see disturbing patterns. Children raised in isolation. Exposed to violence, starvation, and incest. No exposure to empathy. No knowledge of law. Only hunger. Only tribal loyalty. What you get is not a demon, but a child with a knife. And no reason not to use it. Criminologists have compared the Beans to modern-day cults, abuse rings, and isolated doomsday families. What they found. The cycle repeats. Maybe not with cannibalism, but with silence. With secrecy. With the slow rot of morality when civilization looks away. King James' decision, to execute without trial, is still debated. Some say it was justice. Others say it was a precedent too dangerous to repeat. But maybe the real question isn't about the king. It's about us. What would we have done? Would we have shown mercy? Or would we have lit the fire ourselves? Because the Bean Cave wasn't supernatural. There were no demons. No spells. No curses. There was only human hunger. Left unchecked in the dark. And maybe that's why the story still lingers. Not because we fear monsters in the woods, but because we fear the ones we might become. If our cave was deep enough, our hunger great enough, and our world just indifferent enough. The story of Sawney Bean is not just a tale of cannibals. It's a mirror, a reflection of how thin the veil of civilization truly is, and how easily it tears when no one is looking. So the next time you pass a darkened forest trail, the next time you see an old cave carved into the cliffs, remember, some horrors weren't made by monsters. They were raised generation after generation by us. And some stories, they don't end, they wait.